Julianne Gentler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As speakers in this debate have already indicated, this bill is one part of a suite of bills, and the Green Party would like to congratulate the government for taking this very tiny, probably ultimately ineffective step towards cracking down on property speculation in the Auckland housing market. And that's what this suite of bills, as the Minister said, is intended to do. This particular bill is about collecting IRD numbers with respect to property sales and purchases. And we support that. It's going to be incredibly useful to understand exactly what is going on in the property market, because up until now, we haven't known how many of the buyers are using foreign capital to purchase homes in Auckland. We do know that almost half of the sales in Auckland at the moment are to investors. And so that's part of the reason it's more difficult for first-time home buyers to afford our houses, because we have a huge number of investors in the market. And of course you would, because the tax treatment for property investment is favorable to property investors and not favorable to first-time home buyers. So this bill is just about getting the information, getting the IRD number. And we heard from submitters who are professionals involved in this field that it's not going to be an overly burdensome task to get the IRD number, because they're already collecting a whole bunch of other information at the same time. I'm sure everyone knows IRD number, pretty short number, doesn't add a huge administrative burden when the conveyancers already have to collect information. LINZ is already collecting information on the properties, sales, and the purchases. So all it's doing is attaching the IRD number. We heard in Select Committee this morning from officials that it's been problematic not having the IRD number because people use different names or different different spellings of the names. They use all different sorts of things, and it makes it more difficult for officials to understand whether or not it's the same person buying and selling homes. So that's why the exemption that is put into this legislation is so problematic, the main home exemption that most of the speakers here have referred to. It's because it means that we aren't going to be collecting information for a whole heap of property sales and purchases. And we continue to have this difficulty for officials in knowing who it is that's buying and selling the houses.
Point of order, the Honourable Louise Upston.
Mr Chair, I'd be concerned if that member was referring to matters before the Select Committee that were not related to this bill. There may be implications for that member if she is.
Yes, I just remind the member, if you're quoting things from a Select Committee and the Select Committee hasn't reported back, that's privileged information, and the member would be in trouble if you were divulging information in the House that hasn't been released and hasn't been tabled by way of a report back. So from now on, be very careful about anything one might say. Julianne Gentler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what officials said with respect to this bill during the Select Committee was that it was going to be helpful to have IRD numbers, because when we don't have the IRD number, we don't know simply if it is the same person, because all they can refer to is the name, and that there can be quite a lot of variance around that. So it makes it more difficult. Now, the Minister here in the House today and other speakers from the government have claimed that requiring people to give the IRD number when it's their main home is an added unnecessary burden that makes it more bureaucratic. I'm just going to read directly from the submission from the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand, who said the exemption for a transferee or transferor's main home should be reconsidered. That was their recommendation. The main home exemption makes the rules more complex and limits the volume of information on property sales that is gathered, and therefore the value of that information. It says it in the Select Committee's own report from the members, not the minority report. It says, we acknowledge that making an exception for a person's main home adds complexity to the rules and would limit the information available about property transactions. So nobody is arguing that we shouldn't have the main home exemption in the other bill before us, which is the Bright Line Test Bill. But we are saying it doesn't make sense to have the main home exemption for collecting the IRD numbers. And in particular, it's going to make the tax rules more difficult to enforce, because there's this added exception which says that you are required to give the IRD number of your main home if it's your third property that you've sold within 2 years. So if one has bought and sold a main home 3 times, Mr. Chair.
I'm
Mr.
going
Chair?
to call Julianne Genter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If one has bought and sold their property that they consider to be their main home 3 times in 2 years, the 3rd time they are required to give their IRD number, and they will be subject to the Bright Line test. The problem is, how is anyone going to know if it's their 3rd time buying and selling a property if we haven't had their IRD number for the first 2 sales? Part of the problem that the government is trying to address here is the fact that our current tax rules around speculation require on this intention test. And of course, no one is going to declare their intention to buy and sell a property simply for the capital gains if they know they're then subjected to the capital gains tax. And I would argue that here there's a bit of a loophole, because obviously why would somebody declare and put down their IRD number the 3rd time if that means that they're suddenly going to be subject to the Bright Line test? It makes more sense to collect the same information on all property sales and purchases. Then we have all the information we need. There's no additional unnecessary bureaucratic burden from putting down an IRD number with the information. There's already a lot of information being collected and assimilated by LINs. Having the IRD number simply makes it easier for us to enforce the tax rules. And so I would ask members in the House today to rethink their position, to consider what was proposed by the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand, what was brought up by a number of other submitters, including Ernst & Young. This isn't a dramatic change to the legislation. We're not proposing that people shouldn't be exempt from the Bright Line test for their main home, but we are saying in this piece of legislation, which is simply about collecting the information and making sure an IRD number is supplied at point of sale or purchase, that the IRD number is collected and we have the information on who is buying and selling homes. It will make the tax laws easier to enforce. It will give us more information. It doesn't cost anyone money to put their IRD number down on a form that's already being filled out. So I have a supplementary order paper, and I would ask the Minister to consider, I know it's late in the piece, to consider changes to the bill. But this whole bill has gone through under a very truncated process, and it would be really unfortunate to introduce this unnecessary complexity to the rules. We can simply remove, the way the SOP works is in Clause 4, the new Section 156A, Part 1, deletes the definition of the main home. It will, of course, need to be teased out in other legislation if we're going to have the exemption for the main home in the Bright Line legislation. But most importantly, in Clause 4, delete the new Section 156, subsection 2A, which is on page 4. It just deletes all the exemptions. It means we collect the same information on every property transaction. It will actually make it easier to enforce, and it will give us more information. So I would really ask all members in the House here today to consider making this simple change that will make this legislation better. It will make it easier to enforce tax rules on speculators. And I think that would be something that all parties in this House could agree on.
I call Fletcher Tabatau.